Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, faculty members, students, all those of you who joined us today. And thank you for the wait. I would like to bring special greetings to our specially invited guests, of whom I would like to make specific mention as well. We have the honor to be joined by the Premier of the British Virgin Islands, the Honourable Mr. Andrew ALTURO FAHIE, Ambassador Dr. the Honourable June SOOMER, Ambassador Dr. the Honourable Richard Bernal, Professor Jan Boxhill, Deputy Principal of the UWI MONA, Professor David Tennant, Professor Aldrich Henry Lee, Dr. Kirk James, Dr. Phyllis Fleming Banks, Manager of the UWI Open Campuses in the British Overseas Territories. Also a special welcome to the government officials from Jamaica and British Virgin Islands and faculty members of the UWI community who joined us today, Palgrave, Macmillan representatives. I have the pleasure and I'm very happy to welcome everybody at the launch of the book, Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Reintegration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners by Dr. Dacia Leslie, Research Fellow at Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, a UWI scholar, colleague, and book co-editor. I'm Ramona Biholar, lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the UWI MONA campus, and I'm very honored to be the chair of this distinguished event, which is held in the British Virgin Islands and virtually as well, and is a collaboration between SALISES, the Open Campus British Virgin Islands, and the Palgrave Macmillan publishers. Today is particularly special because of the original research that Dr. Leslie's book reveals on the reintegration of ex-inmates into the society, an essential topic to be addressed for ensuring Caribbean development. Dr. Leslie investigates Jamaican state's capacity to meet the needs of inmates. She also discusses issues pertaining to repatriated citizens and asks crucial questions of what works for social reintegration, especially in a developing country such as Jamaica. I'm not going to reveal more on the book itself, which will be discussed by the author herself and the invited reviewers, but I must mention that Dr. Leslie's research is inspired by the recognized need for Jamaica to find more sustainable ways of preventing crime and particularly repeat criminality. Her work also draws inspiration from the first published study by Professor Aldrich Henry Lee on women in prison, the impact of the incarceration of Jamaican women on themselves and their families. British Virgin Islands was selected for this event because of its 2020 status of being placed in the lowest COVID-19 risk level on the US Center for Disease Control, and because Dr. Leslie's ongoing research interest in the experiences of Caribbean's small island development states in successfully managing the spread of COVID-19 pandemic in prisons. Also, today is particularly special because of a distinguished lineup of discussants to celebrate Dr. Leslie's work. To mention briefly the agenda for today, so you know what we have in store for you. We have the honor of Premier of British Virgin Islands, the Honourable Mr. Andrew ALTURO FAHIE, delivering a keynote address, followed by an overview of the book by Dr. Leslie and book reviews offered by Professor Aldrich Henry Lee and Dr. Kirk James. We'll have a brief window for questions, so please write your questions in the chat and we will take a couple of them given the time at the end of the reviewers' comments. And after the question and answer sessions, we'll meet the editor and then Ambassador Richard Bernal will provide the closing remarks. Having highlighted the agenda points of our event, without further ado, I would like to invite Ambassador the Honourable Dr. June SOOMER, followed by Professor David Tennant for the opening remarks. And just a few words about Ambassador June SOOMER. She is often described as a woman of firsts. She was the first woman to receive a PhD in history from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, the first woman to serve as St. Lucian ambassador to CARICOM and the OECS, the first woman to serve as an OECS commissioner, to name a few, as well as the first woman to perform the role as chair of the Open Campus Council at the University of the West Indies. She was ratified as the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States for the period 2016 to 2020, and was recently elected by the UN General Assembly to serve on the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. Ambassador SOOMER, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, Dr. Ramona Biholar, author of the book, Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Integration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners, Dr. Dacia Leslie, keynote speaker, Premier of the Virgin Islands, Honorable Andrew A. Foy, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, UWI-MONA, Professor David Tennant, book reviewers, University Director, SALISES, Professor Andrew Henry Lee, and Professor, New York University, Dr. KIRK James, Professor in Practice, SALISES, Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, Senior Commissioning Editor, Ms. Josephine Taylor, members of the university family, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. As chair of the Open Campus Council, I would like to thank the author, Dr. Dacia Leslie, for her kind invitation to deliver a few remarks at the launch of this timely book entitled Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Reintegration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners. I congratulate her on behalf of the Open Campus for adding this dimension to the research on the reintegration into the society of those previously incarcerated. This book is part of a series that draws attention to minority, excluded, and marginalized perspectives in criminology centered on the topic of race and the racialization of crime and criminal justice systems. This book is appropriately set in a context that understands the depth and girth of an inequality underpinned by the entrenchment of colonialism in all its iterations, historical, legal, political, and socio-economic. As a historian, I recall studying that on the eve of the emancipation of the enslaved in Jamaica on 17 July 1838, Captain J.W. Pringle's report on prisons in Jamaica, ordered by the House of Commons, was published. In this report, Captain Pringle spoke to the issue of prison design, social conditions, and prison administration, and revealed the existence of 30 prisons or houses of correction and jails in the country, and that this did not include the workhouses in existence on the plantations. Recall also that in 1823, there were only 3 schools dedicated to the education of the Black population. By definition, at that time, the word prison was inclusive of every jail, house of correction, hospital, asylum, workhouse, and every other place, however called, which shall be used in any of the said colonies or plantations for the confinement of persons charged with or convicted of any offense. It also revealed that these were managed according to whip and whim and was barely answerable to Her Majesty's officials. The intent of ordering of this report would be the issuance of the number 1 and 2 Victoria C-67, an act for the better government of prisons in the West Indies, issued 3 days after emancipation in the British West Indies. It had the effect of ensuring that the newly freed would understand that criminality would forever be tied to their race. Moreover, it was intended that Her Majesty would ensure some uniformity in the regulation of her prisons, and this would be replicated throughout the British West Indies. To date, throughout the region, Her Majesty's royal prisons continue to thrive. On the eve of independence in the British West Indies, the 1940s social welfare ideology, which envisaged a society which emphasized stability, equilibrium, and functional relationships between the various parts of the social system, had the financial wherewithal to strengthen prison systems in order to eliminate behavior that was seen as deviant or causing social disorganization. Essentially, the Development and Welfare Organization, DWO, had a mandate to ensure that there was no repeat of the disturbances of the previous decade. This explains the reason for such emphasis on centralized police forces, penal institutions and legislation by the Unification Commissions and the DW. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the backdrop on which the Jamaican prison system was built and the stone-breaking social inequality in which it was entrenched. This also accounts for the reluctant challenge in fostering reintegration. While the reviewers will delve into the details of the book, I want to posit that Dr. Leslie has offered policy guidelines in this regard. Her sojourn into the complexities of security, safety, and criminal activity also offer us a pathway for even ridding ourselves of the fear of living amongst and alongside ex-offenders, often our own family members or close friends in our community. In her eye-opening examination into the mindset of ex-offenders, she extracts reflections that give us a glimmer of hope and possible guidance for our own behavior change and behavior modification, as she gives us a chance to touch real people. In reading through the book, I asked, are prisons designed to ensure recidivism? Do we even want people who were imprisoned in our communities? Is the plan to reduce recidivism realistic in small, intimate, resource-deprived communities like ours? Is there even a desire to increase access to tools that would ensure more integration? How are families and communities prepared for reintegration? You see, recidivism is a problem for all of us. Do you believe that they deserve a second chance? In our small communities, we live with failures of our past. Do they even have rights? The strength of the discourse and research fills some of the gaps. Dr. Leslie also makes it clear that the absence of a mature and reliable evidence base about the extent and nature of criminal recidivism in Jamaica also contributes to the challenges faced by policymakers and service providers seeking to reduce the incidence of crime. This is in part related to the dearth of Caribbean scholarship on what is a sizable and multifaceted subject matter, which has impeded more decisive and progressive political and policy responses. That is why the information contained therein is so important. In closing, let me agree with the foreword in the book that this is a must read for policymakers, advocates, academics, students, and anybody interested in understanding the crime situation in Jamaica and perhaps the region. As countries born out of the very notion that prisons rather than schools were a priority, we owe it to ourselves, to our whole community, to make the issue of recidivism and the rehabilitation of ex-inmates a matter of primacy if our desire for secure, sustainable, mature societies is to be achieved. Again, I congratulate Dr. Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Sommer, for giving us important insights on the historical backdrop, as well as highlighting the critical questions Dr. Leslie is asking in her book. I would like now to invite Professor Tennant, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, as well as the Chairman of the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, to also give opening remarks. Professor Tennant, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairperson, Dr. Ramona Biholar, Premier, the Honourable Andrew FAHIE, Government of the British Virgin Islands, Ambassador Dr. the Honourable June SOOMER, Chair, Open Campus Council of the University of the West Indies, Professor ALDRIE Henry Lee, University Director, SALISES, Professor KIRK James, New York University, Ambassador Richard Bernal, Professor of Practice, SALISES, other distinguished colleagues and guests, Dr. Dacia Leslie, author of this wonderful book that we're launching today. Good afternoon. I thank Dr. Leslie for this opportunity to give remarks on the occasion of the launching of this book. But I'm well aware that you have a long lineup of eminent speakers and that your audience logged in to hear you speak about your work, not to hear me pontificate about an area in which I'm well out of my depths. So I will keep my remarks very brief. In a society in which criminality is rampant, most of the public attention and discourse is placed on the criminal acts, the perpetrators of those acts, the individuals and families impacted by the acts, and the police force and judicial system as they seek to identify and bring the perpetrators to justice. Very little attention is placed on what happens either before the acts were committed or after the law is enforced. It seems as if the beginning and the end of the all-important and too often repeated story of criminality in our society has not been fully investigated. And if we don't understand the beginning and the end of the story, and possibly the interconnections between them, is it any surprise then that we don't fully understand and appreciate the reasons behind the vicious cycle of criminality which we face as a society? Is it any surprise then that we have not reaped much success in breaking this cycle? In her own words, Dr. Dacia Leslie has noted that her book entitled Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Reintegration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners, seeks to offer insights into the social worlds of male and female offenders in Jamaica, to better understand what they deem to be the influences that led them to crime and those which might at least assist them in desisting from law breaking. She further notes that finding ways to reintegrate ex-prisoners into Jamaican society is a pressing but complex social, economic, and moral issue. This is due not least to the financial costs of prison recidivism and growing concern over the capacity of Caribbean states to meet the needs of a large number of its citizens subject to forced repatriation to their homeland by overseas jurisdictions due to their offending, end quote. In my own layman's understanding, this represents the beginning and end of a story, which up until now has not been adequately addressed. Why is this important? It is important because the story of criminality has seemingly been inextricably intertwined into the story of our society. And if we're to get to a point of moving beyond criminality being our dominant plot, we need to begin to unravel why and how criminal careers or enterprises get started at the front end. And at the back end, we need to appreciate and acknowledge the difficulties which such individuals face reintegrating into society and make the appropriate policy, institutional, and societal adjustments to reduce such barriers. So colleagues and friends, I'm excited to be here today to learn more about this important work conducted by Dr. Leslie. This is an important and potentially impactful piece of social science research that as a Faculty of Social Sciences, we're very proud of. The Faculty of Social Sciences here at the University of the West Indies is committed to and driven by our FSS Reach vision. And the very first plank in that vision is conducting relevant, impactful research. Dr. Leslie, in conducting this research and writing this book, has added significantly to the pool of impactful, relevant knowledge that the Faculty of Social Sciences has created through our research. In the past 2 to 3 years, colleagues in the Faculty of Social Sciences have published more than 10 books, focusing on diverse but highly relevant topics such as beyond homophobia, creating LGBTQ experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean, Jamaica's evolving relationship with the IMF, Caribbean migration, diaspora networks in international business, males and tertiary education in Jamaica, endangered and transformative childhood in Caribbean small and developing states, political communication strategies in post-independence Jamaica, business intelligence for small and medium-sized enterprises, and international aid under the microscope. Dr. Leslie is a part of this new generation of scholars from the Faculty of Social Sciences who are addressing the key societal issues facing our country and region. By publishing this book, Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Reintegration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners, Dr. Leslie will no doubt fuel another plank of our vision, that is, evidence-based advocacy aimed at the growth and development of our country and region. Dr. Leslie, commendations on your solid, relevant, impactful research. I look forward to seeing how your results will be used to create meaningful, positive change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tennant, for your remarks, and particularly stressing that the beginning and the end of the story of criminality is often forgotten, but it is actually intertwined in the story of the society. So we are not going to forget that line, and also that Dr. Leslie is advocating for evidence-based research. Thank you, Professor Tennant, and now I have the honor to give the floor to the Honorable Mr. Andrew ALTURO, who is who from the 25th February 2019 is the Premier of the Territory of the British Virgin Islands. He also holds the title of Minister of Finance as well as representative for the 1st Electoral District. He has a long-standing political career. He was first elected to parliament rather in 1999 and has been successful to be re-elected in consecutive general elections since. He's currently serving in his 6th consecutive 4-year term. The Honorable Mr. Foy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to say a pleasant good day and God's blessings to each and every one of you. I recognize the protocol that has already been established. And to those joining us virtually, I greet you with BVI love. And to those of you who are visiting us physically, I say welcome to the Virgin Islands. It is an honor for the BVI to host today's book launch and for us to have Dr. Dacia Leslie as our guest, conducting her field visit in the BVI and visiting our UWI open campus. I also consider it a privilege to be invited to deliver the keynote address on this special occasion and to share with you some of my own thoughts on recidivism and the reintegration into society of persons who have fulfilled their debt. At the same time, I do recognize that this is an opportunity for learning as well, given the participation of several academics and scholars in these proceedings today. I wish to begin by congratulating Dr. Leslie on her numerous achievements and accolades, and in particular on the publication of her book, Recidivism in the Caribbean, Improving the Reintegration of Jamaican Ex-Prisoners. This is a significant achievement, and I ask everyone to join with me in a virtual round of applause for her. You see anyone else? So I will clap. Dr. Leslie has taken on 2 of the most challenging topics in the region, and indeed the world. And I don't think I got that wrong, because recidivism is one issue and reintegration is a separate issue, albeit that they are closely related. And I do not wish to find myself in a debate with the scholars, for I am sure I will be outmatched by them. But to my understanding, recidivism is the tendency of an individual to reoffend. Reintegration has to do with the individual being able to become resituated within the society after having been removed from it to serve a prison sentence from some breach of the law. Data and logic suggests there is the high likelihood that a person who is able to reintegrate into society will be less likely to reoffend, although this is not an absolute guarantee. Then there's also the possibility that a person who, after release from prison, is unable to become reintegrated has the odds stacked against them and may fall off the wagon, so to speak. And this is a point that is very ripe for interrogation. This may not be the situation for every individual, but again, what we know tells us that this kind of thing happens. Because we are all aware that there are myriad pressures and challenges that persons coming out of prison can face, and to be frank, will face. They can face stigma. They are battling a loss of trust, because often they are branded as dishonest and dangerous because they have been incarcerated. They have a hard time getting a job, let alone a stable one or a well-paying one. Many of them come out to find that whatever possessions they had is gone. No one secured their stuff, so they have zero resources to build their life. And they are starting all over from scratch, but now with the reputation as an ex-con following them like a shadow. Many of them find that family and loved ones are not there for them. Spouses or significant others have moved on. And so they have emotional pressures and lack of emotional support weighing on top of all the other pressures pressures such as being broke, having obligations, and being unable to find work. Thus, you may have an individual who exits the corrections system as a rehabilitated or reformed person, or at least having repaid the debt to society, with all genuine determination to remain on the straight and narrow and being a productive member of society. But because society refuses to embrace him or her, he or she can be thrown into a spiral. Some may turn to drugs to escape their pain. Some may resort to violence to persons they feel betrayed them. Some may resort to various types of crimes because they cannot get a legitimate job. These are just a few examples of the extensive array of circumstances under which the individual can find themselves back in the correction system as a repeat offender. And I'm not justifying wrongdoing or making excuses for persons. I'm simply saying that there are loopholes in the road, and it can only be a positive thing if some of these hazards could be identified and mitigated, because then some of the lives that get altered and destroyed could possibly have a different outcome. Being labeled as a repeat offender increases the pressures and the challenges that the individual will likely face when they are released. And the cycle will go on, becoming more vicious each time around. This is a recipe for endless despair and hopelessness. That cycle needs to be stopped. Research projects such as the one undertaken by Dr. Leslie and others by researchers affiliated with the University of the West Indies Center for Criminology, the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, and other institutions can help to alleviate despair and restore hope to those who truly need it. Such research can help to shatter the mold in an imperfect, if not broken, system that may intend to do good, but which often ends up doing more harm. This kind of research sheds light on where the systems are failing and can guide policymakers in how to close the gaps so that we can reduce crime, create safer and more productive communities, prevent hurt and injury to persons and lives, and save lives. This kind of research is far-reaching because in offenses against a person, you have a primary victim who is injured or worse. In property crimes, the victim loses possessions and assets that they worked hard to earn, or which had sentimental value. The victim's family members and the wider community are traumatized. Businesses curtail their opening hours or face the extra expense of hiring security. Fear and insecurity creep in among the population that feels unsafe. Then you have the cost to governments and taxpayers for funding the increased demand for resources by law enforcement and the criminal system. Millions of dollars have to be spent in corrections that could have been spent in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And then you also have the lives of the offenders and their families that suffer. Finding answers for how to keep persons out of the corrections system once they have entered it, and how to prevent persons getting involved in crime in the first place has a wealth of benefits for everyone. Indeed, it requires investigating the effectiveness of the systems, programs and methods implemented in prisons to achieve the retributive function as well as the rehabilitative function, and to prepare persons for a life after release. But it equally requires an examination of what is in place on the outside to help these individuals find a place in society where they can thrive and lead fulfilling and productive lives, such that they do not end up on the slippery slope that can land them back in trouble. Caribbean countries with our relatively small economies and the size and limited resources need solutions urgently. A 2020 report commissioned by the Inter-American Development Bank titled Regional Comparative Report Survey of Individuals Deprived of Liberty, Caribbean 2016-2019, the Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, found that in aggregate terms, 41% of inmates surveyed in the 6 countries of the study were recidivists or repeat offenders, compared to 33% of Latin American prison populations. In the Caribbean, roughly 40% of recidivists return to prison within 6 months to 1 year of release, depending on the country. Also, less than 1 in 5 prisoners has access to rehabilitation and reentry services, which have been shown to reduce recidivism programs in the Caribbean. And may I pause here to note that many larger, more developed countries have similar recidivism rates. But I have said, I think that the policies and programs of correction systems is just one side of the coin. The other side has to do with how society is structured and the willingness of the social and economic structures to support persons who wish to lead productive lives when they come out of prison. I do not wish to preempt or prejudice Dr. Leslie's field study, but I am advised that the incidence of recidivism in the BVI is not very high, in the region of about 18% at present. Hopefully, our research will test the accuracy of this claim and provide insight into why this is so, if indeed it is. But one of the factors that might account for this is the fact that the BVI is a small, close-knit society. And when inmates are released, they get emotionally and other necessary support from family, friends, and the community. Stigmatization and shunning are not as prevalent as in other countries. And this could explain why most persons do not reoffend in the BVI. So there may be cultural factors that support reintegration and reduce recidivism that are worth exploring. There may be lessons to learn from going into the individual situations to find out how and why some persons have succeeded in reintegration and no reoffending, and why others have not. And a good way to do that is by talking to persons about their experiences, their motivations, and their situations, as Dr. Leslie is doing in her research and as she reports in her book. I think when we drill down into these issues, what we are going to find is that we need to not just work with the individual offender, but we need to also focus attention and resources on their families and their other support systems, the churches and the NGOs, so that we strengthen the network around the individual and improve their chances of success. As a society, as government, and as policymakers, we owe it to our citizens not to easily write them off just because they may have made a mistake or two, especially when they genuinely want to move past their errors and do better. We have to recognize that despite their mistakes, they are still a part of our communities. They have families who can fare better if they can get back on their feet. They can make a positive contribution to society if they get the chance to do it. But we will constrain ourselves in our ability to help them if we do not make the effort to get a fuller picture and to mitigate those forces that they are fighting against. I often say, in my own words, that we must pay attention to problems such as these, even before they go into prison, to make sure that we try to keep them out. And even when they do get into prison. Because oftentimes we are living in a society that has become very selfish, where we only look out for ourselves and go into our homes and lock up and feel that we are safe, that we are secure. But I always tell persons from the days when I used to teach and in business and everywhere I go, take a keen interest in every young man that you meet. Failure to do so, you may find out later that he may be your son-in-law. Take a keen interest in every female that you meet. Failure to do so, you may later find out that those that you ignore, the one that you ignore may be your daughter-in-law. So these problems have a way of coming to our doorsteps in manners that we least expect. And may I add, have no way of controlling once they reach. So it's going to take a holistic approach in order to curtail these problems, even with those who are in prison. So the work of researchers like Dr. Leslie moves us forward in this goal. You are making a difference, and I do hope that policymakers listen to what you have to say when you make your findings and recommendations. And I know that they will listen, because it's costing policymakers far too much money to run these correction centers than it would if they invest the money up front. So I would like to say, once again, I commend you for your efforts and on your efforts. And I encourage more persons to get involved in researching the problems that face our societies and to identify solutions to transform lives and to make the world a better place. I'd like to say to Dr. Leslie that continue to shine, continue to strive. And whenever you find during this research that you become frustrated or you feel daunted, remain laser focused, stay prayed up, and remember to starve your distraction and to only feed your focus. I thank you.
Thank you so much, the Honorable Mr. Foy. You highlighted some of the challenges ex-inmates face upon reintegration in the society in general, and the issue of barriers society poses for ex-inmates is relevant in Jamaica, in BVI, in other Caribbean societies, making Dr. Leslie's research and the recommendations offered more so timely. So let's hear now from Dr. Leslie, who will give us an overview of the book. And I would like to also present a few words about Dr. Leslie. As I mentioned, she's a research fellow at SALISES and chair of the Crime Prevention and Offender Management Research Cluster, also hosted by SALISES Mona campus. She's also a Commonwealth Scholar, Canada CARICOM Scholar and Research Associate of the Institute of Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island. She has over 12 years of experience undertaking research and evaluation and is the co-editor of Critical Caribbean Perspectives on Preventing Gender-Based Violence in the Anglophone Caribbean, a book that will come up before summer 2022. Her non-commissioned research concentrates on lived experiences of inmates, ex-prisoners, removed migrants, and their child dependents, research that intersects with her teaching focus, which is on development studies with specialization in monitoring and evaluation. It comes with no surprise that she was named the winner of 2021 Commonwealth Scholarship Commission's Research Impact Output Stream Award, which supports research. So Dr. Leslie, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Chair. Please allow me, everyone, to just share a PowerPoint, which will take us through the next 10 minutes. But I believe after Premier's brilliant overview, I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. But just to say again, thank you, Chair, for your kind words, and many thanks to the presenters who went ahead. I am especially thankful to Ambassador SOOMER for reminding us of the importance of history. And of course, Premier introduced the polemics of what constitutes reintegration. It's such a privilege and an honor to have this opportunity to share with you research work that has been ongoing since 2007, and in some ways epitomize a growing body of knowledge on correctional practice and reform in the Caribbean region. But before I proceed to provide you with a quick summary of the book, please allow me to just recognize a few persons. Again, thanks Premier, the Honourable Andrew Foy, Ambassador Dr. the Honourable June SOOMER, Professor David Tennant, Professor Aldrie Henry Lee, Dr. KIRK James, Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, Josephine Taylor, Dr. Phyllis Fleming Banks, Bishop and Lady Pinnock, Reverend and Lady Freckleton, Reverend Garth Minot, Mielta Dorma Dwyer, Professor Andrew Pitthouse, Professor Dale Weber, Professor Ian Boxhill, Superintendent Guy Hill, other distinguished guests, students, well-wishers, and destiny helpers. Thank you so much for coming. After this, I think we can now declare the book launch, but it's absolutely important. I am so grateful. And so I want to also thank Josephine for her willingness to invest in the book, which is a product of years of work mixed with tears, laughter, and prayers, supported by a number of individuals. I especially want to spotlight Professor Aldrie Henry Lee for breaking ground in the field of research that was very much overlooked until the publication of her study on women in prison, the impact of the incarceration of Jamaican women on themselves and their families. That study was commissioned by the Planning Institute of Jamaica. And of course, without the permissions of the Ministry of National Security and the Department of Correctional Services, Jamaica, access to all three maximum security facilities would not have been possible. As such, I would like to use this time to thank the ministry for this accommodation. I see Ms. Shauna Charles, Chief Technical Director in the Ministry of National Security, here with us. Ms. Charles, glad that you are able to join. But I'll also use this opportunity to thank the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission in the United Kingdom for providing the financial support needed to make the vision a reality. I'm also deeply grateful to all the research participants who took time to share their life stories and entrust me with their perspectives on this important matter of national security. For this opportunity, I'm truly humbled. So quickly, just to give you a better sense of what's inside the book. So of course, the book seeks to explore the micro and macro level social factors that bear upon the effective reintegration of ex-prisoners returning to Jamaican society. It sought to address a much neglected area of research by providing enhanced insights into the color and complexity of community and prison life in Jamaica. It therefore sought in some ways to build on the work of Professor Aldrie Henry Lee and Professor Bernard Headley, Professor Headley did work on safeguarding the rights of removed migrants and their dependents. In more recent time, the IDB survey, which Premier alluded to, authored by Nicola Satchel, was done on persons deprived of liberty in Jamaica, and that survey flagged the need to look more closely at youth recidivism involving young persons who were previously held in juvenile detention centers. This is certainly an area for future research that is also being pursued by Althea McBean, MPhil student at SALISES. So within a criminological context, recidivism is simply reoffending behavior. It involves repeating an undesirable behavior that violates societal norms after the offender has experienced negative consequences for the behavior in the form of a negative sanction. Of course, for the purposes of the book, I drew on prison recidivism, which is just one indicator of unsuccessful reintegration. Of course, at the time of data collection, other measures were not available. There are at least 2 other measures in operation now. So the book was inspired by, of course, the need to find sustainable solutions to the high crime rate, the paucity of research and data on the subject. There were reports of, only 45% of inmates who were involved in rehabilitation programs. Of course, one of the things that really piqued my interest was a high murder rate, which Jamaica has, but the very low imprisonment rate. That was particularly interesting to me. At the time, Jamaica's prison population rate was approximately 128 per 100,000. But based on the figure, which you can see on screen, you will see it remains low at 130, while the murder rate stands at 43.9. In OECS country, St. Kitts and Nevis, the prison population rate is much higher at 423, with a fairly high murder rate as well. You will also see in the figure on screen that based on Jamaica's occupancy level for the 11 correctional facilities together, Jamaican correctional facilities are not overcrowded. Of course, this is only if prison overcrowding is defined by spatial density. Additionally, one maximum security facility, Tower Street, continues to operate above capacity at about 195%. So these are some of the things the book seeks to discuss and address and identify pathways to transformation. So the reported and publicly available national estimates of the recidivism rate in Jamaica are based on correctional service measures of readmission to correctional center, previous convictions based on a non-custodial sentence, and then there is a combined measure of the 2. Therefore, if we draw on the readmission measure, the estimated rate of recidivism currently is 28% and 41% when we combine both measures. We see that there has been very little change between 2020 and 21, and this can be attributed, at least in part, to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we begin to seek to draw some comparisons with Jamaica and the British Virgin Islands, we see that occupancy levels are almost on par, males are in the majority, and that's not surprising. Jamaica's custodial population is almost 30 times that of BVI, of course, because of size, but BVI has a much higher prison population rate of 392. The recidivism rate in BVI is estimated to be 18.3% as measured by readmission. So if you were to take into consideration, persons who are readmitted, but they have previous non-custodial sentence, this figure would maybe be higher, as has been the case in Jamaica. So Jamaica's remand population of 37%, as you can see in the table, in some ways it guises the reality that 52% of children in correctional centers for children are on remand, again flagging the need to give greater attention to this vulnerable population. So in seeking to better understand the stories behind the numbers, because the numbers, they don't tell you a lot. High murder rate, but low imprisonment rates. you know, it was necessary for me to do some qualitative research. So I adopted a largely qualitative approach, right? Using the available basic statistics to inform, you know, the approach itself. So in terms of sampling, I drew on a combination of purposive and snowball sampling techniques. This led to 73 semi-structured interviews being conducted with ex-offenders, 55 deprived of liberty and 18 living within the community. 17 service providers were also interviewed, 3 inside the correctional facilities and 14 operating in the community. This data was triangulated with 6 focus groups, 4 conducted in a facility and 2 within the community. All participants provided informed consent for the interviews and focus groups to be recorded. Recordings were transcribed and analyzed thematically, and adaptive theory used to make sense of the data. Majority of persons interviewed inside the facility were serving a sentence for robbery. They were 36 to 40 years of age. Majority were serving also a second custodial sentence. When you begin to try to update this information or have a look at the latest available information, you will see that currently majority of persons admitted to the facilities, in most cases, it's for illegal possession of firearm and ammunition. And when you begin to dissect that by gender, we see that women are now being admitted mainly for murder, manslaughter, and attempted murder, instead of violations of the Dangerous Drugs Act, which was prevalent, or, you know, the most prevalent reason for why women were admitted when I was doing the study. So things have changed a bit, and there's a need to, of course, interrogate the shift in terms of women. So to ensure that persons who are incarcerated are effectively reintegrated upon release, it is of course important that they are supported, not just at the point of prosecution, and Premier mentioned that, but even at the point of arrest. And of course, in the interest of time, I won't go into the polemics of re-entry, redemption, rehabilitation, and restorative justice and their relationship to reintegration, except to say that all these processes are mutually supporting. And when you think about effective reintegration from this perspective, you can think about it as support provided to offenders during the period starting from arrest to prosecution to release and post-release, and therefore this process would involve re-entry, resettlement, redemption, rehabilitation, and restoration. In this process, everyone has a role to play, not just the correctional service. Chapters 1 to 3 of the book clarifies these terminologies. So have a look. It is clear based on the research findings that the risk of recidivism is quite complex and interconnected, and may include limited educational and training opportunities, unemployment, mental illness, weak social bonds, institutionalization, limited housing, or limited relocation options, hardening based on experiences in prison, unsevered gang affiliation, in addition to bounded rationality and untargeted rehabilitation intervention. All respondents felt, however, that persons leaving prison and returning to Jamaican society were ineffectively reintegrated. The main reasons given for this were social exclusion, lack of personal agency, limited family support, and inadequate in-prison provisions. Based on the multidimensionality of these factors, we see why recidivism is an unreasonable KPI of the effectiveness of correctional service performance, because it has all these other elements that's not, these elements which are not limited to the correctional service. So by way of illustrating the inaccessibility and ineffectiveness of public services providing support to offenders, we see in Dada's interview where he states that he was held in custody for 13 days without being charged or put on a police identity parade. According to Dada, this was because he was discovered by a judge walking through the police lockups where he was located, and that judge was startled by the way in which his right to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention seemed infringed. In his words, he says, anyway, him say him they investigate me there, central lockup for 1 week and 6 days, detained, don't charge and nothing at all. I see a judge came there one day, him call me and him say, what is it you're in lockup for? I don't know, and he responds, I don't know, ma'am, them just take me off of the road. I have been selling my goods out there. They take me and say me favor a man, meaning he looks like a man who held up some young persons and take away their money. So I don't see anything. So the judge responds and say, I don't see anything on his card, no identification parade, nothing at all. This is stupidness. So the facilitators of effective reintegration are far less. The barriers are so many, so intertwined, so complex. The facilitators are far less and tend to draw more on various dimensions of community rehabilitation and agency, personal agency, including strengthening social bonds, repentance, shame management, and maintaining a positive mindset. 10% of offenders interviewed within the community were able to achieve a certain level of economic self-sufficiency, and of course this is self-reported, while maintaining their desistance. However, they were either engaged in low-paying jobs or self-employment. Majority could not gain meaningful employment without divulging their imprisonment histories. For majority in low-paying employment, they lived in constant fear that it was a matter of time before their employers received word of mouth about their status as an ex-offender or deportee. For others, it was about the financial support they received that encouraged them to go straight according to the desistance literature. But their new roles as fathers and husbands helped to support their change as well. Having a child and a good woman, some would remark, were roles that were reported that helped to sustain the motivation of some men, right? Pirate's brother, based on the quote, it's in local language, but to interpret Pirate's brother, Andy and Regal explain in the quotes, and through their accounts, we not only see that reconnecting with family helps some offenders to cope financially, but that newly established relationships help others to cope with stigma and or exclusion within the community. So overall, the book shows that ideas and attitudes towards punishment have historical and structural antecedents which are deeply embedded. Reintegration in Jamaica remains associated with post-release. Less understood is that reintegration encompasses arrest, sentencing, rehabilitation, reentry, and resettlement of offenders. As such, Jamaica is yet to adopt a holistic formulation associated with the UK's 7 pathways to resettlement model, which seeks to address needs related to post-release accommodation, education and training, employment, mental and physical health, drugs and alcohol use, finance and debt management, and the well-being of children and families left behind. Notwithstanding that, the department has a number of programs available to some inmates, but there were some difficulties accessing the program, especially the popular ones. And of course, there's a need to evaluate the programs to measure their impact and their effectiveness. So Successful reintegration in Jamaican context tends to be synonymous with opportunities for early release and aftercare, while rehabilitation remains largely correctional based or inside the facility. You think about rehabilitation occurring only inside the facility. But success also suggests that ex-inmates have developed an ability to stay out of prison, but this does not necessarily mean that some have all the requisites to lead crime-free and productive lives following imprisonment, right? So a shift in correctional policy focus towards effective reintegration is needed. Currently, we see rehabilitation and reintegration as two different processes and not one process. The book recognizes that overcoming the deeply embedded attitudes and behaviors towards punishment, especially punishment that focuses on retribution, will not happen overnight, but ensuring that the prison sentence is used as a last resort where legitimate alternatives are not available is one step in the right direction. And I think I will just leave it here for now. Some important next steps will involve continuing to support various public policy processes that seek to improve correctional practice and promote effective tertiary crime prevention. And of course, I would like to continue to support the expansion of the reach of the U in this area of research. And so I'm so happy to the leadership of the UE Open Campus, Ambassador SOOMER and Dr. Phyllis Fleming Banks, as well as the Honorable, the Premier Foy and his team for starting the conversation. And I look forward to strengthening our partnership. Here are some references for students interested in the area. Thanks for listening. Chair, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie. Fascinating. You have conducted groundbreaking research with findings so useful for first understanding the realities of ex-inmates. Not many of us understand really what they are going through, their lived experiences, the realities of reintegration, the realities of recidivism, what are really the causes of repeat criminality, and your recommendations are relevant for policymaking and especially for strengthening the enjoyment of individual rights and the general betterment of society. A must-read book, I would say. And now we can give the floor to comments from the reviewers. I would like to invite Professor ALDRIE Henry, who is the first woman university director of SALISES at the University of the West Indies. She's a sociologist who has researched and published extensively on social policy issues affecting small island development states. Since she joined the university in 1995, Professor Henry Lee has researched and published on public policy, poverty, gender, human rights, and childhood. And she has conducted research for several notable agencies such as Canadian International Development Agency, the Department for International Development, the Caribbean Development Bank, Pan American Health Organization, UNDP, UNICEF, and the World Bank, to name a few. Professor Henry Lee, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. The Honourable Andrew ALTURO FAHIE, Premier British Virgin Islands, Ambassador Dr. the Honourable June SOOMER, Professor David Tennant, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Professor KIRK James, Fellow Reviewer, Ambassador Richard Bernal, Professor of Practice at the Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, Dr. Ramona Biholar, our moderator, Ms. Josephine Taylor, Series Editor from Palgrave, Macmillan, our esteemed author whose book we are launching today, Dr. Dacia Leslie. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to provide a review of Dr. Dacia Leslie's book. I have to claim bragging rights from the start. Dr. Dacia Leslie is my former student, and I am so extremely proud of her. It is the best reward that a teacher can have, participating in her students' book launch and providing a review for the book. What more can I ask for? So I am very I'm very elated today to be part of this process. Now, based on Dr. Leslie's overview, I know many of you have already gone to the website, Palgrave's website, and bought the book, because that was an excellent overview. But ladies and gentlemen, let me give my overview. So recidivism in the Caribbean, improving the reintegration of the Jamaican ex-prisoners is a book which is very timely, given the challenges of crime and violence that face us in the Caribbean. The Jamaica Constabulary Force on its website reported that up to March 2022, there were already 320 murders in Jamaica. High levels of crime affect all of us economically, psychologically, and socially. High levels of crime grip us with fear, anxiety, and unease, limit our social interaction and personal involvement and movement. Crime is very costly. And in 2017, the then Minister of Security in Jamaica stated that crime was costing the government 65 billion Jamaican dollars annually. Undoubtedly, ladies and gentlemen, crime, imprisonment, offender management are key societal issues that need our urgent attention. Professor Anthony Clayton, an expert in the field, also notes the need for Dr. Leslie's book, and it's in the front part of the book if you do buy the book. I know you're going to buy the book. And I quote Professor Anthony Clayton. Jamaica usually has between 3,500 to 4,000 inmates and wards. On average, less than 20% are serving life sentences, so the majority will be released back into the society. It is very important, therefore, to place more emphasis on comprehensive programs of rehabilitation, specifically designed to reduce recidivism. This important book by Dacia Leslie explores the issues and outlines the way forward, end of quote. Chapters 1 to 4, ladies and gentlemen, provide us with an excellent context and set the stage for a profound discussion of recidivism. One quote from chapter 1 prepares the reader for the rich discussion of the topic, and I quote, "Persons seeking to make the transition from prison to the community face significant social adaptation challenges, which influence their jobs, educational and socioeconomic prospects, and overall ability to lead positive, crime-free, and productive lives in the community," end of quote. A key chapter for me was chapter 5, entitled Attempts to Lead Reintegrated Lives, Ex-Offender Perspectives. And you can spend some time there. We heard the voices of the ex-prisoners who have re-entered the Jamaican society. All participants felt that they had not experienced effective reintegration and suffered from shame, stigma, economic and social trauma. Their coping strategies included maintaining a positive mindset, self-rehabilitation, and dependence on remittances. Former ex-prisoners have to live a life of secrecy. And one of the moms, a recidivist, revealed to the author, and I quote, "I don't have a Jamaican accent, so please forgive me," and I quote, to begin the quote, "To be honest with you, I come to prison twice before, and people never know I was there. I don't tell people my business. I say to my son, because he's the eldest, if anybody asks for mom, mom is not there," and stuff like that. When I come back, people say, "Slimmers, you were off the island," end of quote. All in all, ex-prisoners determined that based on their experience after prison, they were resettled and not reintegrated. But their determination to try their best was evident, and I quote Miss Dante, an ex-prisoner. I begin the quote. "An individual has to decide, you know what? Despite all the nonsense, the quicksand and the barbed wire around me, I am going to get something positive out of all of this," end of quote. Although rehabilitation has improved through the years, life in prison is not easy, and the author highlights the harsh conditions suffered by the prisoners. Some felt put down by correctional officers, and I quote, "a male recidivist," beginning the quote. "Some officers aggressive. Some officers don't know how to talk to inmates. They come call you boy, old prisoner, and all different word. Them cuss up, them bad word you," end of quote. The author's titles grip your attention. I like the titles of all her chapters. For example, chapter 6 is entitled In Search of the Silver Bullet. So when you hear In Search of the Silver Bullet, you immediately want to see what's in there. It's insights from the professionals. In this chapter, providers lamented the policy and resource challenges and the limited attention given to ex-prisoners. While praising the support from NGOs, one provider was concerned that some of the ex-prisoners were being welfare dependent and needed to be more independent and unlearn the ritual behavior started in prison. Read chapters 7 and 8 to hear more about the lives of the inmates and their return into the society. I cannot tell you everything. For those lecturers and students interested in the application of critical race theory, buy the book and pay special attention to chapter 9. Drawing on the findings from the previous chapters, there is a discussion of the multiple interlocking factors that perpetuate and regenerate inequalities and in the society. The resilience and agency exhibited by some of the inmates are highlighted. The chapter ends with some important policy recommendations and directives for future research. I quote the author: a national reintegration policy and the supporting legislative framework should conceptualize reintegration as an integrated, holistic process, starting from the time of the arrest rather than close to or following release, as in the case of Jamaica. End of quote. Wonderful, brilliant. This book is a must read by policy makers, advocates, academicians, students, or any Caribbean citizen interested in understanding the issues of crime, recidivism, and rehabilitation of ex-inmates. Although only printed in 2019, the book has captured 2 prizes: the Principal's Award for the Best Faculty of Social Sciences publication for the academic year 2019-2020, and an article associated with the book was the winner of the 2021 Commonwealth Scholarship Commission Research Impact Prize. You have to buy this book. There's no way about it. If you call yourself a serious researcher or an advocate for improved adherence to the rights of ex-prisoners, you must buy this book. If you don't, you are doing yourself and the ex-prisoners that you work for a great injustice. Buy the book. It's on Palgrave. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Henry Lee, for a very insightful account of the book, inspiring all policymakers, scholars, students, citizens to read Dr. Leslie's book. Let's move on, and also in the interest of time, to Dr. Kirk James for comments on the book. Also to note that Dr. James is a clinical assistant professor at New York University, Silver School of Social Work. Important to note about Dr. James, he is committed to healing from the perpetuity of trauma inflicted by white supremacy, while working to co-create a world without police, jails, prisons, and systems rooted in domination. His most recent publication is Black Lives, Mass Incarceration, and the Perpetuity of Trauma in the Era of COVID-19, The Road to Abolition Social Work. As a faculty member at NYU, Dr. James utilizes love and liberatory pedagogy to inform transformative praxis. Dr. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I won't thank everyone personally. I also don't know Dr. Leslie personally, but I'm so proud of her, and I'm so proud to be a part of this conversation. And as I read this, I'd actually rather be in Jamaica to be a part of this conversation, as it's freezing on the East Coast right now. So hopefully part 2 of this conversation will be at UE or somewhere in Jamaica. But I just want to say that, 10 minutes is not a lot of time to review a book, much less a book of this magnitude. And I definitely agree with Professor Henry Lee that if you are interested in this work, if you're someone in the Caribbean, that you should definitely pick up this book. So I want to say a little bit, while reading this book, I couldn't help but realize how connected I was to this book. And I don't know if Dr. Leslie realized that when Sharon invited me to this book review, but I was born in St. James. I actually moved to Kingston in the 1980s and really experienced the political violence that would really come to define our country. I migrated to the US in '86. And in 1994, at the height of, what would become mass incarceration and where the word recidivism would actually come out of, I was actually incarcerated. And the reason I was incarcerated was because 1 in 3 Black men were incarcerated, research would tell us, and millions of men in the United States would ultimately be incarcerated, which would spawn this conversation of mass incarceration and spawn, the term recidivism. I also would be ordered as a quote unquote immigrant. I would be ordered deported in 1997 and ultimately released from prison in 2003. So, the word recidivism is a word that is very dear to me in many ways, not only as someone who's directly impacted, but someone who is also a scholar of this work. And still for me, every time I've heard the word recidivism, it almost sounds like a sci-fi term, right? It's like, what is this word? And, Dr. Leslie really asks us to grapple with this question, what is this word? And for many people, when we hear this word, for me, as a sci-fi geek, I'm like, I connected to ships coming into the atmosphere, like a ship returning from space coming into the atmosphere, recidivism, right? Reentry, I should say, not recidivism, but reentry, the reentry process, which actually leads to recidivism. And in this reentry process, it's such complicated science. It has to be kind of timed to the exact degree, because if not, the ship will burn up. And this is what Dr. Leslie does in this book. She really shows the science and how complex it is for people to come home successfully from jails and prisons. And this is a well-researched book, and it really highlights so much of this science in really beautiful ways. For a lack of time, I really want to just kind of like point out some things that really came up for me. Is, the honoring of people and their stories, the honoring of their narratives. This is such an important piece, right? As a researcher, as a scholar, it's so important that we honor that, the people closest to the problem are often closest to the solution, but furthest from the resources. And this is something Dr. Leslie does really beautifully by honoring the stories and the narratives of not only the people who have been impacted by these systems, but also the people who are working, to help to create successful re-entry, to help people to actually succeed once they're released. And this is incredibly powerful. Chapter 5 was one of my favorite chapters, again, because it really brought forward, the narratives of people who are directly impacted. A piece also that comes out in her research, which I just really want to highlight, and really so many of our previous speakers spoke about that, and it's the relation of poverty to these issues and historical poverty, poverty related to slavery, poverty related to colonialism, capitalism. And, in all the stories, you hear that. You hear the poverty, you hear the struggle. And, I'm so thankful for your vulnerability too, Dr. Leslie. There's a piece where you speak about, just, being overwhelmed by this experience, by hearing impacted folks and hearing their stories, right, which are often not something that we do. We often don't hear their stories. And, and I think it was so powerful for you to speak as a researcher, the humanity of this, that, how overwhelming it was for you to constantly go into these spaces and be touched by the humanity of people who often are seen as the worst of humanity. Chapter 9 is also incredibly powerful, as it really, it kind of is where you throw like the punch. I love it. You kind of like build people up and then you kind of throw the punch. You begin to ask the really powerful questions. Critical race theory, introduce critical race theory, which kind of like asks us to address the elephant in the room, which is our history of colonialism, which is our history of slavery, and which is our continued ideologies and practices that are rooted in white supremacy, which shape our values, which shape how we relate to issues of prison, how we construct, they versus them, us versus them, deserving versus undeserving. And, there's a particular piece in this too that's really important that you bring forward. As a scholar in the history of prisons, it's so important for us to really dismantle this idea of good and bad, which is always underlined in these conversations. Because as Dr. Leslie points out, if we see people as bad, then we're not going to ask the wise. We're not going to put the resources to try to create safety, not just for the community, but for everyone. So that was a really important chapter for me. In terms of like some feedback, right? As I think it's always important to talk about the things that were great and then the things that I wish that could also be improved. And for me doing this work, one of my mentors, Eddie Ellis, he spoke about one of the greatest ways that we can fix these issues is through language. If we understand that we're speaking about people, and you kind of brought that out when you spoke about like the juveniles and the work that was being done to make sure that we talk about young people as young people and not label them. And you spoke about all the internalization. And yet it's important that in my work that we move away from inmate offenders and really honor that when we hear that formerly incarcerated person, incarcerated people, we will remember that we're talking about mothers. We'll remember that we're talking about fathers, brothers, and sisters. As so much of the language, the pejorativeness of the language doesn't allow us to have that human check-in. So we often forget, and I think so much of our work as people who are researchers to dismantle this has to be with language that is always, humanizing of the people that we want to be of service to. Another thing that I feel like you kind of touched on, and I wish you'd have like really asked it a lot more throughout, and it's like, why do people go to prison? It's like the issues of poverty is salient, and you kind of talked about it being like a landmine, but we have to honor this tension, because I think so much of why we're in this situation to begin with is, to your point, that we have allowed policymakers to negate social determinants of behavior, meaning that like we have made policy people tell us that poverty has no relation to crime, that mental illness has no relation to crime, that people who themselves have been victims of harm, won't then themselves commit harm. And I think it's so important that we as academics, we really challenge and we really ask for accountability of our societies. And maybe final piece is that I love that you named the last chapter redemption songs. And for me, the concept of freedom and collective freedom is so important in this work, right? And Bob Marley says, all I ever have is these songs of freedom, right? And we must imagine freedom as a nation, as Jamaica. I love Jamaica, and yet we've never really actualized the praxis of one love. What does one love in action mean? Until we realize that nobody is disposable, till we realize that, every human being should have the right to self-actualize, we will have war, we will have crime, we will have whatever you want to name it, but we will have some type of dissent from a segment of our population. And this is not an excuse for crime, it's the history of this world. Thank you so much for writing this book. Another thing that I would say to you, please take so much of your research and write articles that are accessible to the public, because I feel so much of change in this conversation, again, is to make sure that we're moving this conversation out of the academic space. Because people like me that love, this work, I'll always show up, I'll always dive in. But for people that, that we need to change minds, doing this work is really a change in minds as well, and change in hearts. So thank you so much.
Many thanks, Dr. James, for sharing as a scholar and from your personal experiences to underscore the impact of successful reintegration that Dr. Leslie focuses on this book, and also the humanity, the compassion at the basis of this kind of research, asking the crucial question, what is the praxis of one love? Thank you for those remarks. And I would say now we can open the floor for a brief question and answer session. We do have time for a couple of questions. I already see a number in the chat. So I'm going to read, perhaps I will take two at a time, Dr. Leslie, so you have time for your comments. I would also like to use, with your permission, my chair privilege to also ask you a question, especially, continuing the point that Dr. James mentioned on colonialism. And I would like to ask you, to what extent does your work feature considerations of desistance, and what a decolonized theory of desistance for Caribbean criminology would look like? Also, I'm reading from the chat another question. Did you conducted any analysis of the impact of systemic anti-Black racism in North America and Europe among the deportees population involved in recidivism process? So I would say if you could take these two questions, and we'll continue with two more afterwards.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks to everyone for the congratulatory notes I'm seeing in the chat. Many thanks, Jay, for your recommendations. I certainly agree with you about the importance of being consistent with the language. Now, in relation to the first question about the extent to which my work involved analysis of the impact of systemic anti-Black racism in North America and Europe, just to say some passing considerations were made, and this is an area that I want to delve further into. When I speak about structural racism, I introduce it at the beginning and towards the end in chapter 9, where I look at intersectionality within critical race theory, and especially when discussing some of the challenges faced by persons removed, or I'm being very careful because Jay just said, be careful with the language. But the label often uses deported migrants. So when discussing the challenges and from their perspectives, and I'll use this opportunity to just thank NODM, which is a national organization of deported migrants. They were very helpful in allowing me to, observe how they work on the ground. And so, I mean, like Jay says, they are the experts. They're the ones who are really living the reality, and they know what the solutions are. And so in relation to that, I would say there is much more work that can be done in dissecting the data and looking at it more through racial lens, and especially gender lens. One of the works I'm thinking of doing with Ramona is to look at female recidivism and, probably looking at considerations of race. But one of the things I discussed in chapter 9 is that while there is structural racism underlying all of these issues, and Dr. SOOMER alluded to it, it being steeped in history, when it comes on to measuring it, you don't find a lot of the persons who are sharing their perspectives talking about race on the ground. So what they will talk about is classism or colorism, right? So the book does touch on that, but there is a need to interrogate further as it relates to. I'm hoping at some point in time I can go and interview Jamaicans in the diaspora who are previously incarcerated persons. And I think that, if I do that, then more of the racial considerations will definitely come out in the data collection. So thank you so much for that question. In relation to decolonizing desistance theory, yes. So when we talk about desistance, we are talking about how do persons stop offending, simply put, right? And of course, you have 3 different types of desistance. My work mainly touches on primary desistance because of the focus on the barriers, and the barriers were kind of overwhelming the facilitators in a way. So if I were to say that the type of desistance that I look at, which is primary desistance, which is kind of recognizing that people want to change, but it's so hard that the process of leading a crime-free life is what the desistance literature called zigzag. So if we were to seek to decolonize that, I would say the considerations of race are important, ensuring that it's grounded in the local solution. So it's oftentimes the case to import theory and apply it to our cultural context. But it's very important for us to stay true to a bottom-up approach. And what do I mean by that? Definitely continue to amplify the voices of persons on the ground, so that in a way they are, like Jay was saying, they are the ones creating the narrative and not the narrative being given to us, whether it is from the Western literature or whether it is from policymakers. So I would say use a bottom-up approach, more of a bottom-up approach. I do recognize that I intermix, even though I seek to prioritize the voices of persons formerly incarcerated. I do intermix when it comes on to trying to find a way, not staying in the ivory tower to say, okay, this is how things are, but try to be that bridge between the realities on the ground in terms of policy. So I am aware of that back and forth, and I suppose maybe for future work, it would be nice to, have a more closer look at what it is to just, amplify the voices without necessarily delving so much into bridging the gap between policy and research. But yeah, it's definitely necessary for these findings to make their way into evidence-based policy making. So it's a balance in a way. It's a balance. And so it's just about finding that balance. But very good questions. Thank you so much. Very good comments. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We have just a couple of more questions. Miss Jennifer Jones is asking whether the book mentions the work in Jamaica by Stand Up for Jamaica in preparing prisoners for life after release. Also, she's asking whether the Jamaican government still makes it impossible for any Ministry of Government agency to employ an ex-prisoner. I will continue with the question from Ms. Samoya Smith, who is asking what are some of the key considerations for developing successful reintegration programs? And perhaps we take one more and wrap up also the Q&A session from Ms. Marlene Hines. What is the average education level of female inmates in Jamaica? What percentage completed high school and attended traditional high schools?
Okay, thank you so very much. And I think, Ramona, you must be smiling because Ramona is actually author of a report commissioned by Stand Up Jamaica. And yes, the book acknowledges the work of Stand Up Jamaica, especially in relation to offering educational opportunities inside the facilities. And then for those persons who are au fait with the experience of Jamaica during COVID, you would know that Stand Up Jamaica was one of the NGOs pushing to ensure that persons had opportunities to still partake in the educational offerings despite the lockdown. So yes, absolutely, the book does mention a number of NGOs. If the NGOs are not named, it's because for various reasons, they chose to be anonymous. And in relation to Samoya's question, okay, in relation to the question about women and the extent to which you're asking about their educational levels. Based on the current data published by the Economic and Social Survey of Jamaica, we know that majority of persons going in, for at least 45%, are unskilled. I don't see the data where it's disaggregated by gender, and that's something that I'm hoping as we develop in terms of our information management systems, that is something that we would start doing. I mean, I know the data might be available, but it's not publicly available. So it would require going in to do a survey to, you know, pin down those exact statistics, or making a request to the Department of Correctional Services. But based on what is publicly available, undisaggregated data reported, we know that 45% are unskilled. In relation to Samoya's question about some of the key considerations to make in when thinking about successful reintegration programs, well, I would, in addition to some of the things I alluded to earlier on, I would say non-custodial alternatives to detention, including post-sentencing, should be pursued. Of course, the functionality of, and this is something that I did not get to talk about in the presentation, but it's detailed in the book. But we have some existing transition pre-release hostels, halfway houses that are not functional at the time when I was doing the study. So if they're still not functional, I would suggest that steps are taken to sort this out and perhaps look at the criteria for selecting persons to benefit from this rehabilitation intervention. But in a general sense, I would say, again, I need to emphasize the importance of seeing reintegration as a process and not divorced from rehabilitation, which is the case. I think support needs to start from arrest and go all the way to post-release, maybe up to 6 months post-release. Inside of all of this, I've been doing work on of the need for a more integrated policy that does not just see the need for reintegration for persons formerly incarcerated locally, but there is also a need to have that integrated strategy that reaches to all persons. You know, considerations to the children left behind, the book will highlight, is very important, especially as it relates to foreign national offenders who are incarcerated here, and the safety of their children left behind. So there are a number of things to take into consideration, Samoya. Wearing my monitoring and evaluation hat, I would say we definitely need to evaluate our programs more and use the findings to inform the next steps. And yeah, there are a lot more things that we can talk about, and I'm happy to discuss with you further. But another thing, one thing came to my attention recently was the Bail Act. So there's a need for legal reform. The Bail Act defines recidivism as any person who returns to prison 3 times or more. That definition is inconsistent, and even the definition of children is inconsistent. So I would definitely look at the need to reform relevant laws relevant to the subject. And yes, we can discuss further when you have the time, Samoya.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Leslie. Invaluable research conducted, definitely plans for further research. And I cannot count how many congratulatory messages in the chat for your work that you have done and, put it in this book. So I would say no, we can meet the editor. We are wrapping up and going towards the end of the event. So I would like to invite Ms. Josephine Taylor, who is a Senior Commissioning Editor of Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies books at Palgrave Macmillan. Ms. Taylor, you have the floor.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. It's really kind of you to let me say a few words about this book. It's been such a pleasure to see such great attendance today and distinguished speakers joining the launch to celebrate Dacia's book. I was so pleased when Dacia proposed this book to me back in 2016. As a publisher, it's really important that I'm commissioning books which reflect truly diverse and global perspectives, which decolonize research and tell authentic stories, which this book really does. Dacia recognised that the Western literature didn't address some important questions in the field of reintegration, and she wanted to put a spotlight on Jamaica to explore what reintegration looked like there, which I was very supportive of. For some context, this book published in our Palgrave Studies in Race, Ethnicity, Indigeneity and Criminal Justice book series. This book series is edited by Professors Sean Gabden, Catherine Russell-Brown, Chris Cunning and our newest editor, Coretta Phillips. This is a pioneering series which brings much needed attention to minority, excluded and marginalised perspectives in criminology, including drawing on the voices of Indigenous people and those from the Global South, which are often silenced in favour of dominant white discourses in criminology. Dacia's book fit really well within the series and filled a real market gap, which is really important from a publishing perspective. Her book asks important questions about prisons, reintegration, recidivism, human rights, coloniality and community. And it's been great to explore the book's real-world applications in discussions with people both inside and outside of academia today. Just for some information, the Palgrave Race series is welcoming new academic and critical book ideas and proposals from the Global South and beyond. So please do get in touch with me directly if you want to discuss any ideas. My email is available online. It's josephine.taylor@palgrave.com. And I'm also very happy to pass on ideas to other editors if your idea doesn't sit within criminology and socio-legal studies. We also have loads of resources on our website about how to write a book proposal for early career and mid-career researchers. So we do provide a lot of support for those venturing into book publishing for the first time. We've also published some really great other books in the series recently on race and mass imprisonment, Aboriginal women, law and critical race theory, and on pandemic police power. So please do check them out. We do have a 20% discount code for Dacia's book today, which I'll pop in the chat straight after this. And that just leaves me to say thank you again for inviting me, for organising this launch, and congratulations again to Dacia.
Thank you very much. And we are very grateful to you, Ms. Taylor, and to Palgrave for supporting outstanding work, Dr. Leslie's work. And thank you for joining us today. This has been a most insightful event. We have unfortunately reached the end. Ambassador Richard Bernal, I have the honor to invite you to provide the closing remarks. But before, I would like to mention that you are a professor of practice at SALISES and senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Washington, D.C., and that you also served as the Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs at the University of the West Indies until 2020. And you have plenty international experience as Chief Trade Negotiator for CARICOM, as Jamaica's Ambassador to the United States, to name a few, as well as you have the experience of authoring 6 books. Thank you for joining us, and Ambassador Bernal, the floor is yours for closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Professor Ramona Biholar. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Let me acknowledge the Honourable Premier of the British Virgin Islands, Ambassador Dr. June SOOMER, Chair of the Open Campus Council, Professor Henry Lee, Director, SALISES, Professor David Tennant, Dean of Social Science at the Mona campus, and also the discussant, Dr. KIRK James, and of course, very special greetings to the author, Dr. Dacia Leslie. I've been given a few minutes to do the impossible, which is to try to pull together some of the most important points of the discussion. But I'm grateful for being afforded the opportunity. It compelled me to read the book cover to cover, which I had decided to put away for whenever I had time, but I had to do it now, and I'm glad I did. Dr. Dacia Leslie's book on recidivism in the Caribbean is based on analysis of empirical data gathered in Jamaica and supplemented by qualitative analysis. The insights and recommendations are widely applicable to the Caribbean. This is a point that the Honorable Premier of the BVI made in his presentation, the Caribbean similarities and relevance. Dr. Leslie herself in her comments made some comparative Caribbean data references which were important. The focus of the book is the nexus between recidivism and social integration and how this affects policy in the society. This is something which Professor Tennant emphasized in his remarks, the practical nature of the research which emanates from the University of the West Indies and its usefulness as a foundation for policy and hopefully improve policy. This topic is a long-standing problem in the Caribbean. This is a point that Ambassador Dr. SOOMER made when she gave us the historical antecedents and context of the issue. It is a problem of immense importance given the following. One, the fact that crime in Jamaica and some other Caribbean countries have reached alarming proportions. Secondly, the number of people subjected to incarceration has increased steadily. Although low by Caribbean standards, Jamaica has quite a large prison population in relation to the accommodation for imprisoned people and the conditions of that imprisonment. Thirdly, recidivism is quite high in Jamaica. It is approaching 50%, which is alarming. What it means is that people who are incarcerated are condemned to a life cycle of crime and imprisonment, which is obviously undesirable. This means that the effective social integration, which is aimed at, is an ideal which requires reform so that the people who come out of imprisonment can become productive citizens ideally, but at minimum, do not return to prison. But this has not been the experience. The reasons for the recidivism include not learning employable skills in prison, the debts which are amassed during and before incarceration, limited access to employment after imprisonment, limited financial support mechanisms upon release, and unaddressed drug, alcohol, and mental challenges which are experienced by people who have been incarcerated. A new and worrying context has emerged in Jamaica, and I want to make reference to it. It is the fact that persons imprisoned continue to run their criminal activities from prison. And this is a new development. What it means is there's a continuous involvement in crime, whether the person is in prison or out of prison. Indeed, gang membership in the society is reproduced within prison. So there is a life cycle, and this needs some further research and urgent action to prevent the dons from continuing to run their criminal enterprises from within prison. The purpose of research, such as that done by Dr. Leslie, is not merely to understand the world, but to change it for the better. This is the gravamen of Dr. Leslie's scholarship. What should be done to address the challenge of how ex-convicts can be effectively reintegrated into a social environment which is predominantly crime-ridden and lacking in economic opportunities? In this regard, some of the disabilities imposed on people after they have left prison prevent them from working. There are whole occupations that they cannot access. And I think there is no reason why somebody who has paid their price for their crime and is trying to make a new start should not be allowed to work in certain professions. So While inclusive, people-centered social and economic development is the ultimate solution for both crime reduction and social reintegration, more immediate measures are urgently needed. Among these is a coherent and consistent policy of reintegration. This is complicated by the fact there are some 17 agencies providing aftercare services in Jamaica. They all have different modalities, different objectives, etc. It's also hindered by the fact that the people who go to prison are seen by the society as undeserving of a second chance, and therefore there's a palpable scarcity of human and financial resources. A critical aspect of the reintegration is the role of human agency. It's not an easy topic to deal with, but it is important in the self-rehabilitation of prisoners. And to better understand this dimension, Dr. Leslie interviewed a number of ex-prisoners to ascertain what are the factors they regard as affecting their transition from prison to community. Dr. Leslie examines the personal histories of many of these people, the impact of imprisonment on them, and how they have contributed, very importantly, to the difficulties which they encounter during post-release period. This discussion I found very interesting because it was enriched by Dr. KIRK James, who spoke of his personal experience in regard to these issues. The foundational conclusion is for a holistic policy which reduces recidivism and improves societal reintegration after imprisonment. It means that imprisonment must not be limited to keeping convicted persons out of society, but should focus instead on preparing them for a better chance of being crime-free, productive citizens. This has to be done by equipping them with societal, behavioral, and employment skills, which they often enter prison without. Prison often compounds these disabilities rather than to create a transition from these disadvantages. This has to be accompanied, Madam Chair, by a cultural change in society in the attitudes towards crime, punishment, imprisonment, rehabilitation, and social integration. It has been a rich discussion on a vitally important topic which urgently requires redress by policy. Many of the pointers and ingredients of such a policy are provided by Dr. Leslie in her final chapter. In closing, I join with Professor Henry Lee in saying that Dr. Leslie's book is a must read. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Bernal. Thank you very much to, thanks to all panelists. Thank you those in the audience who joined us. Unfortunately, we did reach the end of this important event, but we do hope that this book launch not only showcase the outstanding work conducted at the University of the West Indies and specifically SALISES, but also inspires to give in-depth consideration to the topic of social reintegration of ex-inmates, so skillfully addressed by Dr. Dacia Leslie in her book, and definitely a must read. So stay safe, everybody. Have a good rest of the day, good rest of the evening, wherever you're located. Goodbye.